right, friends, Greg Kokel here for Stand to Reason. Thank you for joining me today. We got an open mic call day here, which means I'm going to be taking calls that you have registered on our website. And if you go to our homepage at str.org, under podcasts, where it says live broadcast, you'll see everything you need to see in order to be able to leave your question. It's convenient. I didn't even think of this. I wish I could take credit for it. Somebody else did. I think it was Amy. Not entirely sure, but I wish that I had so I could get credit. But the whole idea is if you can't call in during the showtime, which is characteristically 4 to 6 on Tuesdays, LA time, you can call in a sense, by just recording your question online at our website, as I just described, and we'll eventually get to it. And actually, we did one of these recently. In fact, it might have been the last podcast. And we pretty much dedicated the entire show to one guy who calls in with lots of questions. Now, he does not hold my view, and he's atheist, and so raises issues. And I think we're going to start out with Dan once again. There's lots of things I'd like to cover today, but let's just hear from Dan. This first one here is the first one on our list, and about how would I determine which religion is true. Go ahead, Dan.
Greg, how many religions and holy books do you not believe in, and why? Period. If I lay the Book of Mormon, the Bhagavad Gita, and the Quran and the Bible in front of you, Greg, 4 holy books, how would you determine which one is true and which one is not? Period. Do you even understand the methods of epistemology, Greg? Period. Or have you been indoctrinated from birth? Period. Do you fear God, Greg? Period. Are you a slave to your man-made religion? Period. Final question, Greg. What's more likely? That God doesn't exist and that men wrote a Bible to control your mind and your money? Or that God depended upon men to write the most important book in history? What a complete and utter failure on God's part. Period. If God was who he says he was, omnipotent, omniscient, all-knowing, all-powerful, all-loving God, he would have wrote a holy book which is an undeniable, wonderful, gold platinum piece of work that none of us could deny. Unfortunately, the book is obviously man-made, full of Greek and Roman mythology, full of 613 laws from the Torah about eating shrimp and wearing mixed fabric clothing, and how long your sideburns should be. No, this isn't man-made, Greg. No, God cares about how long your hair is and what color clothes you wear. Please, Greg, stop talking down to us on your stand to reason, which has no reason whatsoever.
All right, Dan. Thanks for the question, or I should say questions. There's a lot going on there, and I do have a summary of your statements, but there was a whole much more that's not included in the summary that Amy gave me, and I'm jotting like crazy to stay up with it. So you had actually asked me or raised the issue of my understanding of epistemology in the past, and I'm just going to repeat what I said then, and that is that I have a master's degree in philosophy of religion and ethics, and that entails extensive knowledge of epistemology, which I can not only pronounce, but I can spell. And I graduated with high honors, all right? Now, the point really is not whether I can impress you with my letters, but whether the ideas that I offer are well justified or not. And that's really the question that you've raised in lots of different ways here, okay? So you asked me about different books, that Book of Mormon, Bhagavad Gita, the Bible, etc., and how would I distinguish which one was true? I would ask the question, which one seems to comport best with reality? All right. So when my daughter was about 6 or 7 years old, she asked me a question. She said, how do we know that God is true? And I thought about it for a moment, and I came up with this response. The reason we believe God is true, in other words, the God we hold to be so, is the true God, is because the characterization of that God and reality that we get in Scripture, on my take, is the best explanation for the way things are. The reason that we believe God is true is because he's the best explanation for the way things are. So if you're operating in the field of science, and this is where epistemology is really critical, they have a thing called explanatory power. And it's good for all kinds of things as well. But the point is, you have an effect, and you look at the effect, and you try to infer from the effect its probable cause. And what you're looking for, though there may be a number of explanations someone might come up with regarding that cause, you're looking for the cause that seems to fit the effect best. You're looking for the best explanation for the way things are. So the question has to do with the explanation you offer. Does it have adequate explanatory power? Very basic concept in epistemology, especially with regards to science. Now, so for example, we have a universe, a physical world. The universe hasn't always been here. It came into existence at some point in the past, before which it did not exist. So now it's fair to ask what caused the effect of the existing universe. We know it came into existence, Big Bang cosmology, plus we see the universe winding down, and common sense leads us to the conclusion if it's winding down, it can't have been winding down forever, because it would be at universal heat death at the moment. If it's eternal, there would be no heat, there'd be no motion, there'd be no life, obviously, and we wouldn't be doing what we're doing. So the logical conclusion is it's not been winding down forever, and this comports with Big Bang cosmology. There was a birth to the universe. Now, when something happens like that, it's fair to ask what caused the thing to happen. Now, when it comes to that particular point, you have one of two answers. Either something caused it to happen, or nothing caused it to happen. It was uncaused and just popped into being. So you ask me the question about what's more likely. Well, it's not more likely in my mind that the universe popped into being with no cause, for no reason, and with no purpose. Because there's nothing in terms of cause and effect observation that we see in our universe now, certainly not in day-to-day kind of life, where effects have no causes. So when I reason backwards from an effect, the beginning of the universe, to a cause of the effect, something intelligent and powerful outside of the natural realm, that makes total sense. Now, it may not be true, of course, but it's not stupid. In fact, it strikes me as the odds-on favorite. The one that isn't a favorite is that everything came from nothing, because ex nihilo nihilo fit. That is, from nothing, nothing comes. Now, that strikes me as a very commonsensical notion. Again, we could be wrong about a whole host of things. I'm interested in following the smart option. What is the odds-on favorite? And the odds-on favorite with the origin of the universe seems to me that someone, not just something, but someone, it takes an agent to initiate a causal chain. Someone acted to create the universe, all right? And that's what the best explanation for the way that thing is happens to be. Now, again, I could be wrong. I fully acknowledge that. But again, where's the smart money? What's the odds-on favorite? Either something outside of the universe caused the universe, or the universe is uncaused. Now, people have to decide for themselves, but the question is, what is the odds-on favorite? So when you ask the question, how would you determine which religion is true and which is not, I have to look at the details. Incidentally, in the Bhagavad Gita, this is the foundational document, the Holy Scriptures, as it were, for Hinduism. Hinduism is monistic. And what monism teaches is that there's only one thing that exists, and that is God, in an impersonal kind of fashion. Everything else is an illusion. So when confronted with that option, I have to ask myself, gee, does that seem true? Does it seem true that I am just an illusion? I am Maya. I am God's plaything after a fashion. Maybe that's not the right way to put it, but it's God's imagination. But again, God is not personal. So if I am an illusion, how can I know that I am an illusion? Does Charlie Brown know he's a cartoon character? No, illusions don't have any knowledge. So how can I know that I'm an illusion? You see, that seems incoherent to me. So I am not at all tempted by the claims of the Bhagavad Gita and broader Hindu claims, because they don't seem to make sense. They seem to be incoherent to me. Okay, that is internally contradictory. Not just silly, which is the way you think of Christianity or Christian theism, not just silly. That's actually not a principled kind of response to an idea. But in the case of Hinduism, I think it is internally contradictory. And so therefore it has no appeal to me as an option. Now, when it comes to books like the Book of Mormon, okay, I can read that. It's a story about Jesus in the Americas. Now, they claim that it's historically sound. Okay, do I have any reason to believe that? Well, in that book, about events that happened long, long before before any Europeans came, they have big battles of big civilizations in which people are doing battle with horses pulling chariots. But there were no horses then. The horses were introduced later by the Spaniards. There were no horses native to North America. And there were no wheels. Nope, the Native Americans had no concept of wheels. That also came from Europe. So when I look to assess that book, which is basing its truth claims in history, and the history is clearly false in some cases, and the other things that's not clearly false on the merits, there is no good reason to believe it actually happened anyway. So there's an assessment of that book, and I've discarded that. Now I find something quite different in Scripture. I find explanations that make sense of the world we actually encounter. Now you ask, what's more likely, that God doesn't exist and men have invented religion to control people, essentially? I'm a slave to my religion. I didn't become a Christian until I was 23. I don't know how that works into your assessment. But you ask what's more likely, but you don't give us two options. You just say God doesn't exist. I actually don't think that's likely. Because if I would say that there's no God, then I'm going to have to commit myself to a bunch of things that just seem wildly counterintuitive. I would have to say that everything comes from nothing. That's what we just discussed. I would have to say life comes from non-life. We have no biological reason to think that's even possible. I would have to say that consciousness comes from matter. Again, I have no reason to think that's possible. Nobody's even showed how that is even coherent, how an organization of molecules can cause an immaterial conscious self to pop into existence. All right? I would have to say that objective morality is false, and all we have is subjective moral opinions about things. In other words, well, it's true for me, but not necessarily true for somebody else. But if I were to hold that view, which is consistent with atheism, then there wouldn't be a problem of evil, would there? Because the problem of evil in the world requires that objective rules be broken that we can complain about, not just that things happen that are different from what we want, what we like, what we prefer. Now, all those things seem wildly counterintuitive. I think that effects like the origin of the universe have causes adequate to the effect. I think that consciousness cannot come from matter, but there was when there was no consciousness, apparently, and then there was. What explains that? Well, on my view, I have an explanation. God is a conscious being who made other conscious beings that were also joined to matter, body and soul. Okay, what I'm offering here is that this makes sense. There is explanatory power of this view with regards to the world that we actually encounter. Okay, now you made a comment about Greek and Roman mythology somehow working their way into the Hebrew scriptures. Now, this is odd because I see absolutely no evidence of Greek and Roman mythology working into their scriptures. They were fiercely monotheistic. Doesn't mean they're right, but this disparaging remark has no basis in reality. It's just inaccurate. Okay, Greek and Roman mythology. I don't quite get this. Religion and the Bible were invented to control people. I understand you don't understand a lot of the laws. I get it. But there was a reason for a lot of these laws. Some of them were moral and provided moral guidelines and restrictions regarding people to protect other people. And these laws were given to a theocracy, that's a nation, who needed laws to guide it. Now, some look silly to you about the fabric and the shellfish and whatever. There was a doctor who wrote a book called None of These Diseases. And part of his point was that a lot of the directives given in the Mosaic Law actually helped the health of those who followed the kosher laws. Okay, so, I mean, maybe God just knew what was healthiest for them and built that into the laws. That's a possibility. And if that's the case, then they're not silly, even if you don't understand, at least at first blush, why people shouldn't eat shellfish, which I guess is a bottom feeder or whatever, And, I mean, I had shrimp last night. So I don't have a problem with that, but I'm not living according to the Jewish dietary laws. But many have seen a lot of sensibility in those laws. By the way, there's something else that was going on there, and you talk about the fabrics, etc. One of the things that God was really concerned with is preventing the Jews from adopting the practices of the pagans around them, practices which led to grotesque things like child sacrifice, for example, and abuse of other people, and lots of other things. He said, we don't want you mixing religions. So there are a lot of features in the Mosaic law that is meant to be a barrier of sorts, separating the Jewish people culturally from the Gentiles around them that were following these other laws. And there's a number of things that are like that. But there's also a lot of things in those laws that are for the good of the people. The moral principles that are practiced there and the protections of people that are built into the Mosaic law. I mean, this is significant morality for the sake of managing evil in the society. So, I mean, there's lots of things in any ancient text that we aren't going to understand because we're 3,000 years removed and we are massively culturally removed and we're removed by language. Okay, but a lot of things become much more clear when we understand the cultures at the time and the language and what they were getting at, even though there's still some mysteries, okay? You seem to chalk it up to just a control, that this is just like a control issue, okay? Make people slaves so we can take their money, all right? But when you look closely at the text, that isn't what's going on. There are preachers right now that are on TV that are trying to get as much money as possible. I think some people do that. But that isn't the purpose of religion. That isn't the way religion has worked characteristically, okay? And and this is another point that you did raise before. I'll say something about it because you had asked in the past why couldn't Jesus write his own book, and now you're asking couldn't God write his own book? He's depending on men to do it, and the answer is kind of the same. God had other people do it not because he couldn't, because he was intervening in history to accomplish certain purposes, and he selected people to make a record of those things so that the people could then read and pursue God in the way that that's appropriate to pursue him. So even if I couldn't say anything in response to you, you said, why couldn't God write his own book? I said, well, there's no reason to think he couldn't. He just chose not to. Why? I don't know. What does that do for you, Dan? What is the question, why couldn't God write his own book, which is a bit of a straw man because none of us say that God couldn't do that. But he didn't do it, and how is that a liability on his existence? So you're kind of barking up the wrong tree on that one. All right. Now, we've got more things, and a lot more things, that you have weighed in with, and as time goes on, I will speak to those things. We're going to take a break now, and I want to thank you for that call, and we'll come back to more open calls when I return here on Stand to Reason. All right, back at you here on Stand to Reason. Greg Kokel, your host, and during our regular show on schedule between 4 and 6, here's the number just so you know, 855-243-9975. If you're outside the U.S., you can dial up 562-424-8229. That's 855-243-9975, or outside the U.S., 562-424-8229. Now, I have a question here from Anna, and this question is akin to the one I just addressed from Dan, okay? So since it's akin, I have a few more things to say. Let's hear from Anna.
Hi, my name is Anna, and my friend and I, we are ethnically Chinese. I am a Christian. My friend has been going to church for a few years, but she is hesitant to become a Christian. What is stopping her is because she believes that there are many gods, which is what many Chinese people believe traditionally. So her question is, as we try to explain God to her, is that, well, how do I know it's the real God?
Mm-hmm.
And for example, if we explain to her, well, God created, everything around us, then her next question is, well, how do you know it's God that created it? Why not? Could it be possible that this other God created everything? So if I follow God, how do I know that this is the real God that I am following?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much.
Well, you're welcome, Anna. And, sometimes these questions are a little bit difficult, and we can do our best at answering, and I'll offer some thoughts. And I had just made I've made some comments regarding Dan that might be helpful here, all right? But I'll tell you a question that occurred to me. You said that your friend believes in many gods, and then says to you, how do I know the Christian God is the real God who created everything? Well, wouldn't it be fair to ask her, why do you believe there are many gods? How do you know there are many gods? I mean, it isn't to try to avoid the question that she asks you, but I think it's fair, since she's making a claim contrary to yours and then asking you to justify your claim, it seems to me she bears some burden of proof, responsibility to justify the contrary claim that she's made. Because notice when she says there are many gods, now how do we know whether if it's Yahweh, the Christian God that created, or one of these other gods? Well, how do we know there are many gods? So, I think that's a fair question to ask. Okay, now, I offered kind of a way of thinking about this in my response to Dan, the last segment, and that is the reason that we believe that God is true, as I told my daughter, is because he's the best explanation for the way things are. I actually take the whole Christian worldview in that light. It's not just that God is a better explanation than nothing as the cause of the universe. Something is going to be the cause of the universe, not nothing. Nothing isn't a cause. We'd have to say the universe is uncaused, and that's just wildly counterintuitive. So prior to the existence of the universe, there is something, someone who initiated the origin of the universe. That's the answer that makes the most sense. Now, I guess in principle, somebody say, well, someone or some many. Maybe there's lots of them. And others have more sophisticated arguments against polytheism. I'm not prepared to offer those at the moment. However, there is a claim that the story, and what I mean by the story is the account of reality that we find in the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament scriptures. These go together. By the way, the New Testament is a record of the theological ideas of Jews. One exception, and that's the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, also written by Luke, and those are historical accounts of the life of Jesus and of the early church. The theology is coming from Jews. So in one sense, the entire Bible is Jewish. And it's giving us an account of reality and an account of the problem and an account of the solution, which those are the most important things. Here's what the world is like. Here's how it began. Here's how it went south. Here's how we fixed the problem, and here's how it's restored. So kind of classically, that's creation, fall, redemption, restoration. Or you can say beginning, problem, solution, and they lived happily ever after. There's different ways to characterize it. So now if your friend is going to appeal to many gods, then I think it's fair to ask her, tell me exactly how that works out. Are they just up there, and did they make everything, and do you think that's the case? So I'd like to know what her competing story of reality is. I wrote a book, by the way, by that title, The Story of Reality, How the World Began, How It Ends, and Everything Important That Happens in Between. Okay, and it's meant to explain this kind of full-throated characterization of reality that the Christian worldview provides, building upon the revelation of the Hebrew prophets and the Hebrew writers subsequent to the time of Jesus. All right? There's an accounting, there's a story there, there's a development of something. And I think in the reading of it, we discover a compelling account of reality. And maybe that doesn't sound sophisticated enough for your friend. But what we ought to be trying to do is figure out what's going on in the world. And I don't know if it's enough to just say, as if you're pitting one God against another. Well, you say your God created. How do I know this other God created? Well, you haven't given me reasons why I should think there's another God. There's got to be at least one to start the whole world. Okay, so I don't have any reason to believe there are a bunch of gods. Maybe you do, and I'll be glad to hear it. But it's not just like one God. Let's pit who done it, your God or some other God. There's an accounting of reality, the nature of the world, in a robust sense when we read Scripture. And these things all fit together in a compelling accounting. And when we understand how they fit together, we see a great, not just a cohesion, but a kind of beauty in the connectedness of it all right? And this, I think, is one of the reasons why I believe in the truth of the story, because of the elegance of the connectedness of it and all these different points that I can actually test against reality, the story against reality. I come up with very positive responses. In our story, God actually invades the world. He's not just out there hanging around a trickster or a genie or a Santa Claus that'll do things for us if we manipulate him just so. No, he's in charge, and he has entered into history in ways that can be measured. And this is why so much of the scripture, the bulk of it, is offered as an historical account, principally of the nation of Israel, and then also of the person of Jesus, the life of the person of Jesus, what he taught, what he did, how he died, and what happened after his death, which was his resurrection. That has theological significance. And then what happened in the early church subsequent to that. So this is a God who invades the world in a way that could be measured. So he leaves behind his fingerprints. And when you look at the particulars, you find out, well, there was a man named Jesus. He wasn't a historical person. He wasn't a myth. He wasn't a make-me-up. No historian believes that. They look at the primary source historical documents that are available, and these are known in a popular sense as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and we can assess from those things what took place in the life of Jesus. And those documents show a magnificent individual who worked supernatural works. And the only people who don't think that that part of the story is true are people who have dismissed the possibility of it before they even start reading, which just seems a little biased to me, not giving it a fair read. But I think one of the chief ways of trying to figure out, well, who is this God that is responsible for starting everything, is we look now historically at Jesus, and we see what he did and what he said and what he believed, and then how he gave evidence that the things he says or said are really true. He worked these miracles. They're in the record. He was executed. Everybody acknowledges that. All the historians of every stripe. They all acknowledge, too, that the tomb was empty 3 days later. They essentially all acknowledge, too, that there was a group of men that were his closest friends that actually declared, affirmed, they met him and talked with him and ate with him for 40 days, doing all kinds of stuff with this one who had been dead and now is alive. And then they spent the rest of their life communicating that message at great risk to themselves. In other words, they really believed he rose from the dead. So what are the options? They're lying, all of them? Well, that's a pretty stupid lie. Here's the basic rule about lying, okay? And any kid knows this. You tell a lie that helps you. You don't tell a lie that gets you beaten, whipped, crucified upside down, or beheaded. This is not a good lie, okay? And that's what happened to the disciples. Many of them, that's what they faced. All of them faced the threat of execution based on what they saw, what they said they saw. So why would they lie if they didn't see him? Because it cost them so much. They would know they didn't see. If they're lying, some people are mistaken. Okay, these guys would be lying. And it's not going to be a hallucination, because an hallucination is like a dream. And you can't share dreams. Can't wake up in the morning next to your wife or your husband, say, honey, I just had a great dream. Let's hold hands and fall asleep again, and we'll share the same dream. It doesn't work that way. And you'd have to have the dream multiple times over like the disciples. This is not reasonable. So notice I've done two things. I've taken two steps here. I've given reasons why there's got to be some God responsible for the beginning of the universe. And if your friend wants to say, well, maybe God's, all right. But this God who claims to be the beginner also entered history in a man, Jesus, in a way that can be tested by historians. and the records that were left behind pass all of the tests required for historical reliability, and with flying colors. And these record Jesus' death and resurrection. And so that puts the God of the Bible in a different category of all these other so-called gods. And I'm going to call them so-called gods because that's what your friend is doing, just calling them gods. Yeah, we believe in China or Chinese religion in many gods. All right, well, why would you believe that? You can't just say it as if, okay, now we've got a competing thing. It's not competing unless you give good reasons that your view is true. What I've done is try to give good reasons why there is at least one God, and that God penetrated history and made himself known through the person of Jesus. Well, that's a whole lot better than most other religious views are able to do. And so we're asking the same questions of your friend Anna that she is asking of you, and maybe she's got some answers there. I suspect not, though. There's no parity between that cultural belief in many gods and the belief we have in one God who became a man in the person of Jesus. When I mean there's no parity, we didn't just make this up. We've got very solid reasons to follow the evidence that leads us to these conclusions, where when somebody says, well, I believe there are many gods, and that's it. Silence? What are your reasons? And I think that's what one ought to consider. So in one case, our case, we have lots of good reasons. Could be mistaken, but we're a lot better off than most people who just make declarations about gods, many gods, because that's what their culture says. That's not what we're doing. All right, Ann, I hope that helps. Let's take a quick break. We'll take more questions when I return on Stand to Reason. Well, I think that Dan is one of the most curious guys because he is sending so many questions to us through the open mic. And so I figured, all right, let's have another one. What have I got here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, just in this sheet here. 8. A lot of questions from Dan. Now, I don't take Dan's questions that seriously in one sense. I do in another. This is why I answer them. I don't think that Dan is looking to have his questions answered. I think he's attempting to find ways to punch a hole in the Christian system. Fine, no problem. I take no umbrage at that. And I'm glad to be able to respond to the challenges that he offers because I think most of them don't have merit. And many times when people bring up accusations against Scripture, it's because they're not familiar with the Scripture. So they're critiquing something they don't understand. Now, that doesn't mean that Christianity is true and the Scripture is God's Word, but it does mean that if you have a straw man that you're erecting and then apparently defeating through the way you ask the question, then you're not really accomplishing anything at all. And I'm sympathetic. Look, there's a lot of things about the Old Testament that are hard to understand if you don't have a background, and this is why, there are people like me and others who are going to do their best to give the background to help make more sense of some of these things for those who are challengers. So this one, Dan is taking on the issue of morality. So let's hear what he has to say. Dan?
Greg, all moral systems are subjective, period. There is no such thing as an objective moral system, period. The Bible, the Quran, the Book of Mormon, the Bhagavad Gita, and all other holy books are subjective to that belief. Atheists are subjective to a humanist belief. There is no such thing as a objective moral system. They are all subject to the dogma or the doctrine that they have established for themselves. In addition, you claim that if we don't have God, then we are just molecules in motion. I've heard Frank Turek and William Lane Craig make this argument as well. This is a fallacy, period. We have brains and a system inside of our body that understands pain. We understand well-being and we understand pain avoidance. Our brain is capable of data processing from sights, sounds, smells, data, information, experiences, and a wide range of others. Our brain is able to decipher between those things. If you touch a hot stove, we now know that that creates pain. Our nervous system sends a signal to our brain, and we now store that information. Next time we see a hot stove, we obviously can interpret that as avoidance. This is not complicated. The animals themselves understand that. And animals don't believe in God, but you can watch any animal species on the planet, and they understand pain avoidance. They understand well-being. So, my point here, Greg, is that there is no such thing as an objective moral system. Certainly, the Bible is not an objective moral system. In addition, I don't kill babies, but God does. I call that an injustice system. A God who orders the Israelites to murder babies and rip open pregnant women, as he stated in Isaiah 13:16, Numbers 31:17-18, 1 Samuel 5, etc., etc. The amount of genocide and baby killing at God's command is, in my opinion, my subjective opinion, and incredibly immoral.
All right. I guess he's covered the bases there, many of them as usual. I'm just going to deal with the last one first because I think that your challenge is disingenuous regarding the alleged immorality of the Bible. You give a long description of the terrible behavior of people being ripped apart and children being butchered, etc., etc., etc. It is quite obvious, I think, to everyone listening that your complaint is an objective moral complaint. And this is why you describe it the way you are, because people are responding to I think you're intending people to respond to the description of what is terrible. I'm not going to take on the justification or the characterization of those events. I'm just saying the way you describe it. This is grotesque and immoral. And then you close with the disingenuous point, in my subjective opinion. If it is your subjective opinion, then who should care about what you like or don't like? Because that's all your objection amounts to. If it's subjective, that's your personal thing. But you're reaching out trying to explain to other people how gross and awful and immoral and unjust these behaviors are. But then you say, but that means nothing morally. In fact, you can all disregard all of my histrionics there, because that's just my personal moral opinion that has no bearing on anything else. What you are saying is that what you are talking about is your feelings. You're not even talking about the behaviors. That's the nature of relativism. And so when you describe yourself as a relativist, which you've done by saying there's no objective morality, and then characterize something in the Bible in very grotesque terms so people react and say, ooh, that's really bad, and then say, well, that's my subjective opinion. Whatever you've given with the left hand, you've taken back with the right. You could be, I think, a little bit more explicit with your point at the end by saying, and I'm not saying that any of those things that I just described are actually bad. All I'm saying is I don't like them. They're distasteful to me. I wouldn't do that. But I can't say they're bad. And the reason you can't say they're bad in themselves is because you've declared for us here that you deny the existence of an objective moral system. okay, which means there is no evil in the world. There is no evil in the world. Now, Dan, if we were here, I'd ask you, have you ever objected to the existence of God based on the existence of evil in the world? Now, I don't mean things that happen that you don't like, because that would be like you saying, I can't believe in God. Why not? Brussels sprouts. What? How can you say God doesn't exist because of Brussels sprouts? Do you ever taste those things? They're disgusting. Well, yeah, I agree with you. They're on every menu in the land right now. But nevertheless, I don't know why something disgusting to you personally could mean God doesn't exist, because lots of people like Brussels sprouts. That's why they're on the menus. But that is what your objection diminishes to in a relativistic world. No, the objection about evil in the world against God is only meaningful if there is real evil in the world outside, not just that God allegedly does things you don't like. It's a preference. This is the fatal fall of relativism, because what you're going to have to do if you're going to hold on to your relativism is you've got to acknowledge there is no evil in the world, and you're going to have to take back what you said so descriptively about the Bible. Maybe descriptive isn't the point, because you could just describe what the Bible says, but you cannot act in that description like something wicked was taking place, because you don't believe in wicked. And you add as a little footnote, in my subjective opinion. That's what's disingenuous. Dan, so, step up to the plate on the morality issue, okay? Now, you mentioned that if there is no God, we're just molecules in motion. That's a fallacy. Now, you never spent any time explaining how the conclusion about the nature of reality, molecules in motion, is fallacious. You went on to talk about how our brains function a certain way and we could feel pain, and that morality is pain avoidance. Did you ever hear, thou shalt not commit adultery? Now, that is a moral dictum, not only of Christianity and Judaism, but a lot of other religions too. And even people who don't believe in any religion still think it's wrong to go out on your wife, for guys, and vice versa for girls. All right? But how is that pain avoidance? That sounds like it's pleasure avoidance, not pain avoidance. You can't explain all these moral elements that are part of our culture as mere attempts of avoiding pain, because there are all kinds of restrictions based on moral views that people ignore because they want to feel pleasure. You might have said you just have all those moral views because you're trying to keep people from feeling pleasure. That would have been a more accurate description of people's response to morality. Why aren't if morality is just pain avoidance, everybody would be perfectly good because nobody wants to feel pain. But the fact is, morality isn't about pain avoidance. And the counterexamples abound. I've just given you a few. All right? And animals don't count, because animals don't seem to they know pain, but they don't seem to operate in any way, shape, or form in moral categories, and we don't expect them to. Human beings do, consciously, not to avoid pain. Most of the moral restrictions are just the opposite. Do not steal. That's not to avoid pain. That's to keep you from doing something wrong. Stealing might bring a lot of people pleasure. It does. That's why so many people do it. Anyway, pain avoidance. One other thing. This is just a little side point. I'm not sure I understand why you do the punctuation marks. Hey, Greg, comma. There is no objective moral system, comma, because we're simply acting out to avoid pain, period. Okay, you can do that if you want. I just curious. All right, let's see. We don't have time for another one. So I'm just going to, say a little bit more about this. I actually have done a number of debates about morality, And I wrote a book called Relativism, Feet Firmly Planted in Midair, because I think that's what Dan's point represents. And when I said I think there's some dishonesty, intellectual dishonesty going on here, it's because I don't think anybody could actually live consistently as a relativist. And this is why Dan's characterization of those biblical things was thick with the sense that these things were wicked. Did you miss that? I didn't. But at the same time, he's denying that such a thing as wickedness exists. So why belabor those particular points? By the way, if there is no objective morality, then Mother Teresa is not good. She's just doing stuff. And by the way, was Mother Teresa avoiding pain in the way she lived her life? No, her life was characterized by all kinds of hardship and difficulty and on behalf of other human beings, because humans are different than animals. That was her view. Now, most people think Mother Teresa is really cool, and what she did was noble, but noble is a moral category, so that's not going to work for relativists. Most people think that we ought to treat other human beings in a particular way. Some even expand that to animals, but they're just expanding the objective moral categories. Do you ever say, Dan, I got my rights? You can't do that. That's wrong. You got to read me my rights if you're going to. Well, you don't have any rights that are transcendent, meaningful, solid, if there is no objective morality, because rights are moral claims. A right is a just claim to something. Okay? In virtue of justice regarding this circumstance, you ought to allow this for me. But if there are no moral obligations, there certainly is no justice, which is a moral category. If everything's relative, then we have no rights. We can give people latitudes. We can invent rights for a while, and then we can take those rights away, because that's all they are, invented. This idea of moral relativism is so absolutely thick with problems, absolutely thick with counter examples that show it to be false. The notions of relativism are radically counterintuitive. And in fact, nobody can live this way, Dan, not even you, which is why you complain about the wickedness in the Hebrew Bible. But I'm glad for your call. All right, that's it for this hour, friends. Greg Kokel here for Stand to Reason. Give them heaven. Bye-bye now.